Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a legal question with massive implications. Can a president be charged with crimes for actions they took while in office,
Yeah.
even if those actions were connected to their campaign?
It's a really fascinating area of law. And this case really pushes the boundaries.
Yeah, we're looking at excerpts from a legal motion. We're looking at page 649, and then it jumps around a bit.
Right.
63 through 67, 77 to 74, and then finally 91 and 96.
Okay.
But we'll break it down, don't worry. These pages all center around this idea. Whether certain actions by Donald Trump, were they part of his official duties as president, which is a key factor in figuring out if he's immune from prosecution.
Yeah, cost presidential immunity. That doesn't mean that a president is above the law completely.
Right, so walk us through this. What are the different types of immunity a president might have?
So think about it like this. Some presidential actions are considered, essential. They're so essential to the function of that office, so deeply rooted in the Constitution, that they have absolute immunity. Think about things like conducting foreign policy or,
Pardoning a turkey at Thanksgiving?
turning a turkey at Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
It's serious business.
It's important.
But then there are other actions, right? So these are actions that are definitely considered official, but maybe not as core to the job. And for those actions, there's this presumption of immunity. However, that presumption, it can be challenged in court.
And that seems to be the big question here.
Yeah.
The special counsel is trying to prove that what Trump did isn't something that falls under those protected official duties. So they're arguing his actions, particularly his public statements, those were made as a candidate, not as the president.
Exactly. And it's not enough to just determine if what he did was potentially illegal.
Right.
They have to prove that he was acting specifically as a private citizen, not using his official powers as president when he did those things. And to do that, the courts are going to be looking at what they call the content, form, and context of his actions.
Okay, so not just the what, but the how and the when of it all.
Exactly.
So let's start with those public statements. This document, it really hones in on some of Trump's speeches. Specifically, they talk about his campaign rally in Dalton, Georgia. This was January 4th, 2021. And then, of course, the Ellipse rally on January 6th. What's so important about those two events?
Well, you would usually assume that if a president is speaking publicly, they're doing so in their official capacity as president, right?
Right.
But here, the document is arguing that Trump was very deliberately using the language of a candidate, like he was on the campaign trail still, not the president of the United States.
Give me an example.
So he repeatedly refused to concede the election. He claimed victory. He even talked about wanting to, quote, go back in time to, quote, fix the results. He constantly pushed these claims of election fraud. And importantly, he used we to refer to himself and his supporters, not the nation as a whole. These weren't, your typical policy speeches. They weren't calls for unity. They were campaign rhetoric. And that rhetoric, that was aimed at rallying his base.
So they're painting this picture of Trump intentionally blurring the lines between candidate Trump and President Trump. And they're saying that that distinction is really crucial here.
Exactly. And it's not just the speeches. The document also looks at his use of Twitter.
Oh, okay.
Now, you might think, well, people tweet about everything. That can't be that important.
Right.
But they focus on the which and the how of his tweeting. So the document points out that Trump mostly used his personal Twitter account, that real Donald Trump, the one he had way before becoming president.
Right, not the official one.
Yeah. And that he kept using after he left office, too.
So they're saying he's using that personal account, not the a POTS account that's, passed on administration after administration.
Right. They're arguing that this suggests that, when he was tweeting about the election, he wasn't actually acting in his official capacity as president.
Interesting.
And they even point out how, the official TOTUS account back then, which he did use for, official business sometimes, it was pretty quiet on all those election challenges.
Oh, it's a pretty big contrast. But they get into the specifics about his tweets, too, right? Like, there was something about a Mike Pence card. What was that all about?
Yeah. The document claims that tweet, which Trump retweeted on December 23rd, was part of this pattern of him putting pressure on Vice President Pence to overturn the results of the election, even though Pence repeatedly said he couldn't do that he didn't have the power.
Right.
And then, of course, all of this culminates in that,
That tweet storm.
Yeah, that flurry of tweets on January 6th, where Trump very publicly demands that Pence takes action.
It's pretty unprecedented, trying to influence an election through social media. So it sounds like they're saying it's not just what he was saying, but whether he really believed it.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. So the document, it digs into these claims of election fraud that Trump was making,
Yeah.
more ballots than voters, dead people voting, all of that.
Right.
And they acknowledge that simply making false statements, that's not necessarily a crime.
Right.
But the key for them, the argument here, is proving what they call intent. So did Trump know that these claims were false? But he kept pushing them anyway to try to hold on to power. That's the question.
Because, I mean, if you truly believe something,
Mm-hmm.
even if it turns out to be wrong, that's different from just, knowingly spreading lies. But how do you prove what someone else was thinking, especially when that someone is a former president?
Right. It's a huge challenge, to say the least. It's going to be up to the special counsel to convince a jury that Trump knowingly, intentionally, was spreading false information to try and sway the election. And to make their case, they point to some specific examples in this document.
Like what?
Well, they bring up that whole saga with the Dominion voting machines and the claims that, they were switching votes.
Right.
But they point out that even Trump's own attorney general at the time, Bill Barr, told Trump directly that those claims were bullshit.
Wow.
Yet Trump continued to say them publicly.
So even when he was told to his face that this wasn't true, he kept going.
Yeah. And they also highlight Trump's efforts to influence officials in those key states after the election.
Those phone calls.
Yes. Those calls where he's pressuring them to find him votes.
Right.
They're citing those calls as further evidence of his intent to interfere with the election. They focus on how he's specifically targeting officials from his own party and only in states that he narrowly lost, and pressuring them to overturn how their state voted.
It's really interesting how they're putting all of this together, like piece by piece, tweet by tweet, phone call by phone call, this whole narrative. They even mentioned that some of his own advisors warned him that what he was doing might be illegal.
Right. They even bring up Rudy Giuliani, who, according to this document, advised Trump that some of these schemes could be unlawful.
So the special counsel is saying that he was warned over and over,
Yeah.
but he just didn't listen.
Yeah. But it's important to remember this is just one side of the story. It'll be up to the courts and then a jury to decide if the special counsel has actually proven their case, whether they can really show beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump's actions were not only potentially illegal, but that he did them intentionally.
Talk about pressure. Can you imagine being on that jury, having to decide whether a president's words and actions are protected by the Constitution or if they're actually crimes?
It's a heavy question for sure.
Yeah. Well, with that cheerful thought, are you ready to dive into the final part of this thing?
Let's do it.
All right, so we've made it to the final part of this deep dive into presidential immunity. And it feels like they saved the best for last. Because they're not just talking about the legal ins and outs here, they're really hitting on the bigger picture, like, what does this all mean for the country?
Yeah, this is where it really gets interesting, right? Because now we're not just talking about one man or one election anymore. We're talking about how this case, it could actually reshape how we think about the presidency in the future. Like, how far can a president go in using their power for their own personal gain?
It's like you hear that term imperial presidency, and we've seen it throughout history, right? Certain presidents who kind of pushed the boundaries, got away with things that you look back on and think, how did that happen?
Exactly. And the special counsel, they seem to be anticipating that argument. Like in this document, they come right out and say that this isn't about weakening the presidency. It's actually about protecting it.
Okay, so flashback to high school civics class.
Yeah.
Checks and balances, separation of powers. It's all coming back to me. But really, why does this even matter to everyday people? Like, this isn't just for the lawyers in the history books, is it?
No, because those basic ideas we learned in high school, those are the foundation of our entire system. The idea that no one person, no part of the government gets to call all the shots. And if a president, any president, can just decide that they're above the law, especially when it comes to something as important as our elections, well, that throws the whole system off balance.
Yeah, it's like it undermines this whole idea that our government is supposed to be by and for the people.
Exactly. People might be less likely to vote. They might not trust the results of elections anymore. It sets up this dangerous precedent that could really hurt our democracy in the long run.
So they're arguing that this is bigger than Trump himself. It's about drawing a line and saying this far and no further.
Yeah. It's about accountability. It's about making sure that nobody, not even the most powerful person in the country, is above the law. Because if we don't hold our leaders accountable, what does that say about us?
It's a big question for sure. This whole case, it feels like there's so much writing on it.
There is, absolutely. And it doesn't matter how it turns out legally. It's making us think about these really important questions about the presidency itself and really about the future of our democracy.
Well, we may not have all the answers, but we've definitely given everyone something to think about.
This is really just the beginning of the conversation.
Exactly. We've explored the arguments, we've dug into the legal stuff, and hopefully you, the listener, you're leaving this deep dive with a better understanding of what's at stake in this historic case.
And maybe even a few questions of your own to think about as this all unfolds.
Because that's what we're all about here at the Deep Dive. Digging deep, asking the tough questions, and trying to understand our world a little bit better. Thanks for joining us.